Hitman 2-3, this is Hitman 2. What's your status? Over. 2-3, stand by. Goliath, this is 2 Bravo. Request permission to engage enemy paratroopers and attempt to snatch a grid Papa uniform 259er, 119er. Break. Enemy is unaware of our presence at this time. Over. Solid copy. Hitman 2-3, Echo 5 Foxtrot. This is Hitman 2 actual.
Hey, good evening, everybody. This is Ben Powers coming at you from the Commander's Voice. My guest tonight is Mr. Sean Michael Chick, and he's author of this book called Dreams of Victory. It's a biography of Toutant-Beauregard, a Confederate general. Most of y'all following Confederate history probably know him very well. He was there from beginning to end, and this is an excellent volume. I think it's the latest volume in the Emerging Civil War series, which we've been discussing here on the channel. So, Sean, welcome.
Hello.
Okay, I'm really excited to have you tonight. So I just kind of want to jump right into it based off the conversations we're having before we start recording. So you are a Louisiana guy. I think you got your bachelor's and master's degree both in Louisiana. And so I imagine that this was sort of a son of Louisiana whose career you wanted to explore a little bit. So could you kind of introduce us to how you decided on Beauregard as a subject?
There's a few things. One of them is the Louisiana connection. So there's like places that he lived. Of course, there used to be a street named after him, a statue here. But there's his fingerprints are still around, of course. In addition to that, there was also the debates when the statue was being taken down. And I knew things about Beauregard, but I gave him, I guess, more of a thought at the time. And that's around the time I reread the T. Harry Williams biography, which is a very good book. But there were parts of it where I felt like Williams may not have understood his subject sometimes. I hate saying that because it's overall a really good book, but and actually I think other authors are much worse about this, where Beauregard is depicted as an overheated Creole with ridiculous ideas on strategy and as a difficult subordinate, which I actually think is very true. And I think I think a lot of the books misunderstood his military capabilities, and at the same time, misunderstood the kind of culture he came from. And you can kind of actually see that during the war. Mary Chestnut, of course, keeps her famous diary, and Mary Chestnut, there's insults thrown at Beauregard the entire time, and a lot of it's based on the fact that he is a Creole. And so I think he comes out of this. He comes out of a culture that is unique, not just to the South, but America in general at the time.
Very
still
interesting.
to this day.
And you've hit on 2 points that I want to bring up or explore further, I should say. The first one being, in my survey reading of Civil War literature, Beauregard very often comes across as almost two-dimensional. He's almost like a cartoon foil to a more capable commander, whether it's Albert Sidney Johnston or whether he's being compared unfavorably to general officers who are commanding up in the Army of Northern Virginia. And I don't think he gets his due the way you explore him more fully. And it's interesting. That's the first point I want to bring out. He's always represented as sort of a contrast to a more able officer. And my second question, or the second point I wanted to make, ties into the Creole culture, which you bring up. Maybe he was considered an outsider. And could you explain like what a Creole is and what that truly means to the audience? I think a lot of people may not be familiar with what that actually entails and how that is a separate, subculture, and it's a society unto itself almost.
Got you. And I want to make clear, actually, a lot of historians don't treat him as a comic foil. Quite a number of them don't. Like for instance, in the Shiloh literature, he's not treated that way by, maybe a little bit by Larry J. Daniel, but definitely not by Timothy B. Smith. And other books such as How the North Won the War treats Beauregard very fairly, I would say.
Oh, and that's terrific. And I'm going to be the first guy who says I have not read deeply on this subject. I am not Mr. Civil War, so I just have my popular impression. So anything you can to bring the man forward, that'd be great.
Yeah, no, they're just that there are a number of books that do it, and very good books too. One of the ones that really made me think about this was Mark. That's going to say Mark Grimsley's book, The Hard Hand of War, which is an excellent book, but he starts it off. He quotes Beauregard doing some overheated rhetoric about, Northern marauders will be coming down to Virginia to despoil the land. And he called this one of the war's early grotesqueries. And I'm like, well, Beauregard's just trying to rally the men. And he's doing it in this over-the-top way because he comes from a culture where, you know, being over the top, being extra, that works. And you mentioned the thing about a Creole. Okay, so the first thing you say about a Creole is that this term means something, this word means something different depending on where you are. It's different if you're a linguist, it's different in the Caribbean. I'm going to give you the definition that I give on tour that seems to work. For the purposes of Louisiana, a Creole is someone whose ancestors came here and this was a colony. They were maintaining the colonial traditions of Louisiana, and almost all of them are of French, Spanish, and or West African descent. And I say that because some people think Creole is purely a racial category, that you have to be African to be Creole. Not true. Technically, you could be Irish and be Creole, like 100% Irish. Highly unlikely back then. Not a lot of Irishmen running around Louisiana in the 1700s. The important thing is that your ancestors came here and this was a colony, and you yourself are also trying to maintain some of Louisiana's colonial traditions.
Okay, that's a very helpful definition. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but could one assume by 1850, 1860, there was an anti-American taint to the term, whether it, regardless of a racial implication, just the fact that it's a colonialist, you're not all in on being, hey, I'm a Native American in the 19th century sense of the term, you know, a son of America. I'm not an immigrant. I'm not trying to preserve immigrant traditions. Was there anything associated with that, or am I reading too much into it?
No, something like that. The Americans and Creoles had a lot of antagonism. So for instance, Beauregard was not taught to speak English as a kid. He learns that when he's like, I want to say he's 8 or 12.
Oh, wow.
I'm sorry, forgetting on the top of my head. Oh, yeah, he was very good at languages. He spoke several of them, including Spanish, which is one of the reasons why he accepts the surrender of Mexico City, because he's the only officer on hand who speaks it fluently. But so Beauregard's grandfather on his mother's side, absolutely, like his father, Beauregard's father, said, we're in America now. You need to go to an American school. His grandfather's mother's side was like, no, these Americans are terrible. I do not want my grandson being tainted by them. So the deal they made was that Beauregard would attend a school in New York, but one run by a pair of Napoleonic veterans. So that was the compromise. So
that's a heck of a
Beauregard is coming in this transition phase when, you know, there's still these hardcore Creoles who absolutely hate the Americans that are coming in. But then there are ones like his father, who, of course, his father's definitely a Creole. Most of his friends are. But his father's like, hey, we're not leaving America. Louise is not leaving America anytime soon, I don't think. And you need to be acclimated with the dominant culture. So eventually, of course, Beauregard learns how to speak English. And, well, of course, speak it very, very well. He had only a very slight French accent, although some people said they could never hear it. Somebody said they could hear it. I think probably he still had a slight French Creole accent. So yeah, there was a lot of antagonism. In the 1850s, actually, Beauregard ran for mayor of New Orleans. And it was a ticket that in large part was made up of Creoles and immigrants, because the Creoles were, the Creoles were allying themselves to some of the Irish because they're fellow Catholics, but also the Nativist Party, you know, the Know Nothings, the American Party, whatever you want to call them. They're really big in New Orleans. I can't emphasize that enough. When the Know Nothing Party collapses in the rest of America, it actually wins in New Orleans.
Oh, wow. That's saying something.
Oh yeah, by 18 like from 1856 to 1862, they run the city. Yeah, so they're actually, the height of their power is during the Civil War here. So there definitely was. Now, to be fair to the Nativist Party of New Orleans, while definitely is not a pro-immigration or pro-Catholic party, it seems to have downplayed some of that as compared to other nativist parties in the country.
And would you say that was because of a significant minority population of Catholics, that, you know, that's a block you don't want to antagonize because it's more significant than in other regions of the country?
I think the hope was simply to peel votes off.
Fair enough.
And I'll have to be honest, 1850s Louisiana politics, not an expert. I know a few things about it. I do know it's very violent. So people say about Reconstruction, they'll be like, oh, well, you know, Reconstruction, you see this upsurge in violence. It's already happening in New Orleans. There's already political mobs fighting each other in the streets. A judge had been murdered. A judge was murdered in the 1850s. And Election Day was a very violent day in New Orleans. Very violent. So you already have a lot of violence from that. And you have a lot of corruption, especially from John Slidell, who was the senator here. He literally what he was doing was moving voters from parish to parish.
Oh, wow.
So they would vote in different precincts.
Gotcha.
And not in small numbers either. Like he had a steamboat bringing them up the river.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So Louisiana politics is, I mean, it's pretty much always been a fraught, corrupt affair, but the 1850s is definitely one of its worst periods.
So, this kind of really gives a sense, not that Beauregard himself would be a corrupt man, but that he comes from a colorful environment, I think is the best choice of words here, which would kind of contribute to that larger than life personality that somebody like me, who's not a student of this, would perceive. That.
Yeah. On the one hand, Beauregard is not corrupt. And this actually is one of the things that hurts him in politics. Like the one office he got elected to was late in his life, and he was removed very soon after because he wouldn't play the game. In that regard, he kind of reminds me of the Louisiana governor, Michael Hahn, who was the governor who wins in 1864. So he's the Union governor. And I kind of joke on my tour because I go by the governor's mansion. His governor's mansion was briefly in the Garden District, what's called Colonel Short's Villa. And I would say, oh, Michael Hahn, I mean, German immigrant, lawyer, very decent man. Hence why I completely failed in Louisiana politics. It's true. No, Michael Hahn, it's in terms of pure politics, is a failure. And that's because, and the same thing with Beauregard. That's one of Beauregard's big weaknesses, is he does not know how to play the game, either if you're playing the game in the corrupt way or even in the way that Jefferson Davis knows how to play the game. Because Jefferson Davis is a capable politician.
Certainly. Understood.
I very much agree with William J. Cooper on that. I do not think Davis was a bad or incompetent politician. He knew how to have, he knew how to foster certain political networks, and people who were friendly or allied to him were diehard.
Oh, there you go.
Yeah, so well, go ahead.
No, I was just trying to bring the conversation a little back into, because we're exploring Beauregard's youth, and he's going to school. He's being trained by the Napoleonic veterans, and I'm assuming soon after, that I imagine he was, like you said, 8 to 12, a few years of schooling, and then he's off to the military academy. And was that a martial glory kind of thing because he'd been exposed to Napoleonic lore and ideas of glory, or was this an idea of it's a free education? What drove him to the military academy?
Military glory.
Fair enough.
Probably, I mean, I'm sure there have to be other ones, of course, but I've never run into a Civil War general who went to West Point so invested in the idea of, I want to be a great general.
Okay.
He'd already studied Napoleon's campaigns. Very few officers, probably only Henry Halleck and maybe Robert E. Lee, knew Napoleon's campaigns as well as Beauregard did.
Interesting.
So he had already made a pretty extensive study of those campaigns. His time at West Point is weird in that he doesn't make any friends, really. There are a few. I get those like anecdotes about like, Grant was a great horseman at West Point. Robert Lee doesn't get any demerits. That's not really a lot for Beauregard. Like there's a few, like he apparently like set a record for kicking a ball across a field. And he pined after Winfield Scott's daughter, and they actually thought about getting married, but they got blocked. But some of this just has kind of a gossip. I mean, I put it in the book, but because it's not implausible, but it does have a bit of a gossip thing to it,
Certainly.
But yeah, his fellow generals in the Civil War barely remembered him at West Point.
Interesting.
He seems to have stayed to himself and studied and graduates second in his class. One thing to lay to rest, though, he was not the teaching assistant to Anderson, the commander at Fort Sumter. All right.
That would have been something right there.
Well, he might have been in the summertime in unofficial capacity, but he was actually never in official capacity was he a teaching assistant. That was some stuff that was said after the war because, it sounds cool, right? Like, the
exactly.
student hired the master at Fort Sumter sort of thing.
But I imagine they, at least in an unofficial capacity, would have crossed paths at the same time. They were.
Oh, no, they knew each other and
Okay.
knew each other and had a good regard for each other. And that story also might have come from the fact that their messages, before and after the Fort Sumter bombardment are very cordial. And also, Beauregard allowed Anderson to have a gun salute when Fort Sumter surrendered. In fact, I found some Confederates who complained and said he was too lenient.
Understood. Early days, right? At that point, it isn't invested in the hard hand of war, so to speak, to go back to what Mark Grimsley titled his book, kind of early in the war before the bitterness really set in, I imagine.
Yeah, and also they're just I think these people also were really, I think it's one of these that contributes to the Civil War is that they're really excited to get into this. A lot of them. I mean, I know there are ones who dread it, of course, but there are people north and south who, for one thing, can't wait to settle the issue. But there's a palpable, that rage militaire, I think is what the author of Embattled Courage called it, which is a book that gets a lot of flack today, and probably understandably so, but does have good points in there. And I think he's got a good point about 1861. These men are just loving it. They're in uniform. Mm-hmm. You know, a guy like Beauregard can't wait. He gets to reenact the Napoleonic Wars. In fact, he wrote a thing before where he said, we can achieve victories swifter than Napoleon through use of the railroad and the steamboat.
So was there I don't want to jump too far ahead to 1861, but you raise a great point. Was there a sense at Beauregard that, hey, destiny had arrived at this point? Finally, this is my opportunity to be the great general that I pined to be?
Oh, yes. And he's seizing it immediately. Now, think about this. Before, in 1850s, he'll kind of do this after the war, too. Actually, not kind of. He does a lot. He's frustrated. He had done really well in the Mexican War, exceptionally well. Played a key role in several battles, in particular the Battle of Chapultepec. But he felt that he didn't get enough credit, and he considered leaving the army. And that's something to keep in mind. Guys like Sherman left the army to go be a banker. Rosecrans left to go be an engineer. Beauregard, despite his frustration, stayed in the army, but he thought about going to help William Walker out in Nicaragua. And other officers dissuaded him because they said, you're one of the best officers in the army. Stick with it. You will move up the ranks. So in that regard, he's excited that war is coming, but it should also be noted he's not a hardcore secessionist or fire eater. He definitely believes secession's legal. Actually, I'd argue most Americans at that time think it is. But he doesn't think even in 1860, he doesn't think civil war is coming. His letters, he says like, oh, they'll work it out. We're not going to go that far. He's excited when the war comes. He's a bit eager for it, but he's also not somebody egging it on.
Understood. So going back to his graduation from West Point, second in his class, so obviously Corps engineers guy. How do you square the circle with a really smart guy in the Corps of Engineers, but wants to be a great general, where you would think a more traditional combat arm of infantry, cavalry, artillery would have been the background, or not the background, the branch that he chose. So to be able to be exposed to combat maybe as a subaltern.
You never get to choose your branch. It depends on what rank you graduate. West Point this time is the premier engineering school of America. That's one of the ways West Point survives, because remember, it's founded when Thomas Jefferson's there, but he doesn't want to create a military academy that will create a military aristocracy. He emphasized engineering. And so there's no like choosing in that regard for him to get into. And also being an engineer, that meant that he was on Scott's staff, and the Scott's engineers acted not just as staff, but also as scouts.
Okay. So
he sees a lot of action in Mexico. He's under fire many times. In fact, he takes part in the storming of Chapultepec. He's almost he's almost the first guy to take the Mexican flag. Well, not take the Mexican flag down. The actual soldier jumped off the walls of the flag, but he's almost the first officer to raise the American flag at the fortress.
Got it.
So yeah, it's to be in the engineers is the most premier position that you can have.
Got it. Understood.
Although one thing to say, later on, West Point changed that, and Sherman was one of the guys who got the ball rolling on that, because he said, why are we sending the lowest ranked people into the infantry, which is the decisive arm?
Mm-hmm. It makes sense to me. And that's kind of my understanding and experience with it as a modern day soldier. So that's very interesting to hear it. For a while, it was tied specifically to class rank.
Yeah.
Very cool. Okay, so now this gets us through the Mexican War, gets us up into the 1861. As you intimated, he is in command of the forces in Charleston, South Carolina, when they fire on Fort Sumter, takes Anderson's surrender. So he's kind of the man of the moment at this point, right? He's the first guy to be in combat with Union forces, so to speak, even though it was a long range bombardment. At this point, I'm assuming he was a popular hero right now, because he's the only person to have exchanged fire with the Union forces at this point in time.
But he is the popular hero. He is the Confederacy's. I call him a little nickname for him is the hero of 1861. He is until the Battle of Shiloh, he is the most popular general in the Confederacy. Nobody else comes close.
Okay, and because he rides that reputation to first Manassas, where again they're victorious, but Joe Johnston and Beauregard. And so, how does he wind up going from Eastern Theater to Western Theater and in a subordinate position to Johnston? That's a very, I'd like to share that with our readers. Like the hero of 1861, but now he's a second in command rather than in charge of his own army.
That's what's frustrating. So, Fort Sumter falls, and he is given command of the army at Manassas, which is the largest Confederate army. But he's not the highest ranking officer because there were people who outranked him in the pre-war army, antebellum army. And that led to a lot of controversy. So for instance, when they actually made the full general rank in the Confederacy, Joseph E. Johnston complained that he was fourth ranked. And he said, well, I should be number one because I was a general. And then he got into an argument with Davis about the fact that, well, yeah, you had the rank of general, but it was in the commissary department, or was it commissary? Anyway, he said, and I favored those who had a higher rank and who actually, like Albert Johnson, for instance, who commanded an entire regiment, and so did Robert E. Lee. So he thought that they should have rank above Joseph E. Johnston. Beauregard had not gone above major. So the idea was, we all know you're an excellent officer. In fact, in some ways, we've up jumped your rank compared to some other guys, but these other men had higher ranks, so they're higher ranked than you. But he's still given the largest army, wins the Battle of Bull Run, and then finds himself under the command of Joseph E. Johnston. This is a very frustrating time. Beauregard makes lots of proposals and plans that are constantly turned down. Now, this is where you get into some of the things you can be most critical of Beauregard on, is that sometimes he's depicted as creating these fantastical plans where everything works. And there's a lot to criticize about Beauregard's plans. His plans were grand in conception. They had two issues. A lot of times they would ignore logistics, or they just didn't pay it as much heed. But more importantly, he always seemed to make a plan with the assumption the enemy was going to do what he expected them to do. Now, that said, the overall conception of the plans were good. He tried to follow Napoleon's maxim: march divided, fight united.
Got it.
And so I would say his plans are not terrible, but they definitely have problems. All right. But I mean, you can get, read some of Grant's plans. Those get pretty loony as well. All right. These plans, though, were just being constantly turned down. Beauregard at one point says, send me to New Orleans, which probably would have been a good idea. He had worked on the defenses of Louisiana through most of the 1850s. I mean, he knew the area better than anybody. He had all his connections here as well. So that would have been an inspired choice. But Davis, this is also, by the way, when him and Davis are falling out. Before this, they had at least a friendly relationship, but that relationship is now starting to come down. One of the reasons is Davis's political critics were latching on to Beauregard as their hero. And so he's also starting to be seen as a political rival, even though Beauregard himself is not actually making political maneuvers behind the scenes. But a lot of his friends, like Charles Villeray is one of his best friends. His first wife was his sister. He's a Confederate senator, for instance. So he also does have a lot of major political support in the Confederacy. And a lot of those people are critical of Davis. At any rate, he's really frustrated. And then a proposal is put forward to say that, we'll transfer you to the Western Theater. And that's because the Confederates had just lost the Battle of Mill Springs in Kentucky. That's the battle George Thomas wins. Mm-hmm. And crushing victory. Of course, Thomas is, I would argue, the best overall tactician of the Civil War. He smashes the Confederate force there. And they propose sending Beauregard west because, for one thing, he's frustrated in Virginia. And also, it will boost morale in the Western Theater. Because remember, he is their premier military hero. So he's sent west. Davis actually sends a letter to Albert Johnson saying, I'm sending you a capable officer. His letter doesn't overly praise him because remember, their relationship isn't as good as it used to be, but he does say he's a capable officer. I'm hoping he'll be able to help you out. And now Beauregard is second in command to Albert Johnston. And the thing about Albert Johnston is literally everybody in the Confederacy is second in command to him or lower. I mean, if Robert E. Lee and Albert Johnston were on a battlefield, Johnston is in command. He is the highest ranking battlefield general of the war. So that's how he finds himself in command. And him and Johnston will have an odd relationship. They're not particularly like friends, but they don't undermine each other. And after Fort Henry falls, Beauregard is sent to Western Tennessee to oversee a concentration of Confederate soldiers there, while Johnston will oversee the evacuation of Bowling Green, Kentucky, and then Nashville, and then march over to connect with those Confederate soldiers that are concentrating. We'll eventually concentrate at Corinth, Mississippi.
Which leads us to April of 1862.
Yeah, and the battle that will determine the rest of Beauregard's life.
Understood. So for, a lot of folks probably understand that Sean's alluding to Shiloh here. So Battle of Shiloh, 6-7 April 1862. It's a Confederate attack on forward Union positions as they're proceeding. I guess even though it's moving south, they're moving up the Tennessee River towards Corinth, Mississippi. And Johnston is determined to attack the Union forces under Grant where he finds them. And they develop a fairly simple plan, in my opinion. Move to the side of guns and make contact and try to drive them away from the Tennessee River and pin them up against, I think it was Owl Creek. But could you kind of lay it out for the audience of what Johnston intends to do and then what happens on the ground and how this affects Beauregard?
Yeah, you could do an entire show on that.
Yes, sir.
This battle. I think only Gettysburg has more debates than this one, and that might be because Gettysburg's a little more famous. Not that Shiloh's not famous.
Yes, sir.
But there's so many big personalities involved in Shiloh, and afterwards, a lot of people debated on whose idea was this or that. But essentially, here's what we have. By late March 1862, the Confederate Army is concentrated. The men are given a little bit of a rest. They're organizing them. About April 1st to 2nd, 1862, the decision is made to attack. Beauregard advises it. Johnston agrees to it. Beauregard and his chief of staff, Thomas Jordan, drop the march plan, which is overly complicated, especially considering the rough terrain and the fact that these men have never had to undergo a march into a battle. That's different than what happened in Tennessee when they were retreating from Nashville. I mean, that's not a leisurely jaunt, but still, you're just trying to get away from the Union. And that's not that hard to do in the Civil War because, that's why pursuit in the Civil War is nigh impossible. If I run away from you, unless you have an army of Kenyan joggers, you're not catching them, okay? So the retreat from Nashville wasn't that quick. You got to get up to Shiloh. You got to do a forced march through rough terrain. With some of these men are fresh out of camps of instruction in a few cases, so big breakdown in the march up there. And the Confederates were supposed to attack on April 4th. And they're also delayed by rain and confusion on the roads. So they shoot for April 5th. That doesn't happen. That night, Beauregard tries to convince everybody we can't attack. He's like, there's no way the Union doesn't know we're here. There's no way. He says they'll be entrenched to the eyes. We'll be gunned down. We must retreat. And then Albert Sidney Johnston famously says, we attack them. I'll attack them at daylight. I would fight them if they were a million. You mentioned the thing about the plan. There's a lot of criticism of Beauregard's attack plan, which is attacking in waves. I'm going to say pardon me on the audience on this one because I just actually found recently in my very last bit of Shiloh research Beauregard's explanation for why he did the attack plan. And I can see what he was kind of going for, which was that they wanted to attack in waves and force them back. And the attack plan was poor, but did have one advantage. It meant that the Confederates could get a lot of forces in there relatively quickly, I would say, because if they attacked in columns down the roads in Shiloh, that would have been hellish because you had to go down the road and then deploy in battle line. Mm-hmm. And the Shiloh, the terrain there, I mean, there's a lot of open woods, as they call it. So it wasn't it wasn't all like a tangled mess, but still deploying in woods, open or not, is not easy. So you have to do all of that, deploy like that. So he said his idea was deploy them in line now and then just push forward. The problem is that Albert Sidney Johnston is trying to attack to get the Federals off of the river and into Owl Creek. And also Johnston had a poor map of the area. The maps are made were terrible. And he thought that it would be easier to get them off the river than it actually was based on the way the map looked. But Beauregard's attack waves and just the nature of the terrain means actually they forced them off of Owl Creek into the Tennessee River. So battle is very quickly a confusing mess, heavy casualties on both sides. For the Federals, there's the embarrassment of being taken by surprise. Now I say that, and of course people would be like, well, they weren't taken by surprise, they were pickets. I'm like, okay, yeah, they didn't storm the camps and fight. They didn't bayonet guys in their beds. But you had men literally like, hadn't eaten or weren't able to eat breakfast, had to suddenly find themselves in a battle line.
Roger.
And a lot of men suspected something was up, but the necessary precautions had not been taken by Grant, William Tecumseh Sherman, Benjamin Prentiss. So very, very embarrassing. It's ridiculous. And so the Union is out of position as well. So you have two armies that are poorly deployed. For the most part, poorly deployed. The Confederates mostly poorly deployed. Union out of whack. Losses pile up though. Confederates launch many unsupported frontal assaults where casualties are heavy, but in the end, they do force the Union back towards Tennessee River. Of course, Albert Sidney Johnston dies during the fighting, leading his men heroically from the front. And this adds a lot to the Johnston myth because he is a minor lost cause figure, especially in the issues of Confederate Veteran, where they constantly harp on, if Johnston had lived, we would have won Shiloh. And Johnston dies at 2:30 p.m. He died after launching a successful attack that did not turn the Union left flank, but forced it backwards and inflicted heavy losses. So a successful assault. And the idea was that when he died, there was some lull in the battle. And actually there was. In his sector, there was a brief lull in the battle. But a lot of that had to do with the men being out of ammunition, disorganized. And I think Johnston not being there probably added to that as well. But it's overstated, this lull. But the idea was that, and then Beauregard's in command, and he pulled the army back before it could attack Grant on his last line. Now, for anybody who's seen Grant's last line, the terrain there is very difficult. Grant had a lot of artillery. I'm not saying an attack there would have never, ever, ever worked, because for one thing, a lot of those artillery units, like one of them literally never fired a shot. So they were they were being trained on the field. A lot of the Union regiments and forces that are lined up are in very, very, very bad spirits. Morale is low. There's at least 5,000 stragglers hugging the river. So would an attack have worked? I don't know. But the thing is, the sun is setting. And also, the best spot to attack Grant's line is not where the Confederates are trying to attack it. The best spot would have been, to the west, because there was a gap in the line there. And one of the Confederate brigades, Cleburne's brigade, had actually attacked and routed several regiments in the area. So if there were more men there, who knows what could have happened. But once again, it's very doubtful because the sun is setting.
Also, I don't want to get too theoretical, but you get that whole idea of what classicals would call a culminating point. You've got the Confederates have fought all day to get where they are. And Beauregard at that point is not in charge of an organized army. They're depleted of energy. They're depleted of ammunition. I'm assuming that regiments are mixed. Just what you imagine after a day-long battle, what formations would look like. So is he really in charge of something where they could have coordinated one last attack, or would it have just been a headlong rush on the gun line and hope for the best?
That's what it would have had to have been, and that could not work where they were attacking. Maybe in Cleburne's section, but there's nobody there. But the other thing too to keep in mind is something else happens. The Army of the Ohio arrives. Now, I know we're getting the Shiloh debates here, but if somebody asks me so why did the Union win Shiloh? I'm like, Buell. 15,000 extra men.
Roger.
And I know I say Buell, people are like, well, wasn't he kind of cowardly or incompetent or overly cautious? And I'm like, he's not cowardly, he's not incompetent, and I'd say he's more prudent than cautious. Later, after the war, Sherman intimated that Buell wanted to retreat. I found zero evidence for that during the battle. None at all. And Buell was at the front line. Throughout the second day of Shiloh, he is at the front, ordering regiments forward. This is really Buell's high point. Because, later on, a lot of Buell's own men hated him. but not at that moment. The letters about Buell after Shiloh, also Grant's men. Grant's men after Shiloh, most of them say, I hate Grant. In fact, I've run to several letters. They say, I want to shoot him every time I see him. They all heap praise on Buell and say he won because of Buell. But after the war, when Grant is the hero of the war, they change their tune and they write in their, they write in the National Tribune, oh, we never needed Buell. Like, oh yeah, nobody ever needs 20,000 fresh men. Nobody ever needs that in a battlefield. Sure thing, So Buell's arrival at the end of April 6th is not that important at that very moment because only one of his regiments is engaged in repulsing them back, and not particularly heavily. The good thing about the night of April 6th is he has arrived, and suddenly the morale in Grant's army I'm not going to say it's soaring. Lots of men are still defeatists, but the number of letters, they're like, I thought we were all doomed, and then I saw Buell's men, and I knew we would win. Sherman said the same thing at the time. So Grant's army, that's another thing to keep in mind too. Like, let's say Beauregard's army, it's so complicated. They're at a culminating point, like you said. They're a lot of them don't have enough ammunition, but these are also troops who are victorious at this moment. And Grant's men do not feel that way. But I don't know. To make that attack work, the Confederates would need an extra hour of sunlight. And even then, keep in mind, there are still some Union soldiers in the line who are definitely going to be willing to fight. And there's plenty of artillery and the terrain is rough. So attacking where they would might have also just been a damn massacre. Who knows? Because it never actually happened.
Understood. But this gets us into the 7th of April, where she said, now reinforced by Buell, the Union, launches their counterattacks and it turns into a Confederate retreat, correct?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
And, one of the things that also complicated matters was that night of April 6th, Beauregard received a message from Colonel Benjamin Helm, who's Kentucky Cavalry, had detected Buell, but he detected one of Buell's columns moving towards Alabama. So the message Beauregard got that night was Buell's not here yet.
Oh, wow.
And they had the steamboats that were bringing up some of Buell's men, right? And when they heard those steamboats, one of the men on Beauregard's staff actually writes, I assumed that it was Grant's army retreating.
Understood. So they misinterpreted the signs they were seeing and based their.
Yeah, now there was some warning. And Nathan Bedford Forrest did a probe and discovered that Buell was there, and he never got to talk to Beauregard. Why is not known. General Hardee seems to have blown him off. So Forrest was not able to get his intelligence in that Buell was there. So in the early morning, they attack, and Beauregard's first response when the Union attacks is actually just to attack as well, because he was thinking that he knew that Grant had at least received Lew Wallace's division, and I think what he was thinking is that, okay, Grant's going to try a desperation thing to strike at us. If we strike back at him, we've got him. By noon, he knows it's up. Now, in some ways, the second day of Shiloh is Beauregard at his best. He is moving regiments all around. He is rallying troops. He will actually lead several attacks towards the very end of the battle. And there's those kind of battlefield dramatics, which he had done at Bull Run as well, that are really important in the Civil War. I mean, not every general does them, because that's not every general's like forte, like Grant, for instance. But somebody like Beauregard was good at that. And I think that's one of his strong points as a commander.
And as a professional soldier, a fighting retreat where you get off with your army intact is a very difficult thing to accomplish. Unfortunately, it doesn't look good in the press. All people are thinking is that you've lost. Yeah,
to be fair, also the retreat kind of turns into a rout pretty quickly on the road back. They're really lucky that the terrain not conducive for defense. Civil War cavalry was not trained for pursuit, and also it takes a while for cavalry to get good at their job anyway. And the Federal cavalry in the West, I mean, this is the early war. They're pretty bad at their jobs. So not much of a pursuit was even really attempted. It also really helps that the entire Union army is exhausted. And that includes Buell's men, because getting to Shiloh is not an easy thing. We're talking about for instance, McCook's division forced marched all day, got in a transport at night, got let off. They didn't have any of their camp equipment, and then they went straight into a fight. So Yeah, yeah. At a certain point, actually, the Federals also start, and you also find a lot of Grant's army as the second day goes on. A lot of Grant's own regiments would attack. They might drive off a few Confederates, and then they would just stop because they're tired. Or here's one for you. A regiment attacks, and as soon as they found their encampment, they would go, well, later, dude. we're gonna, which their camp's been ransacked, of course, you know, so they're all being like, you know, trying to find their letters and pictures and, you know, food and whatnot.
Understood. So at this point, though, so I guess it's safe to say this is where Beauregard's reputation takes its hit, and he's kind of no longer the hero of 1861. He's the man who lost Shiloh, especially because there's a martyred Albert Sidney Johnston to be compared to. We were winning when Johnston was alive. What happened? I'm guessing might have been the response here.
Yeah, it didn't help that Beauregard after the first day of Shiloh prematurely sent a message saying we've won a great victory.
Gotcha. So you kind of have a crow.
Like Bragg did the same thing at Stones River. So Beauregard gets the thanks of the Confederate Congress for losing Shiloh, you know, because they don't get the memo fast enough. Icing on the cake for that would be losing Corinth, which, you know, that's Corinth is a pretty difficult situation. Halleck takes command, and he has Grant, he has Buell, then he has John Pope's army brought over. A fun fact at this time: a Halleck's man is Pope. That's his guy. That's the one that he brought east with him.
Got it.
To Virginia. That's also the reason why Pope stayed employed for the entire war.
That protection from the top.
Yeah. Well, my Civil War conspiracy theory is that there's a Halleck clique, and at the end of the Civil War, almost all Union high commands are held by Halleck's friends.
Interesting.
Yeah, Sherman, Pope, Ord. I say Grant. People go like, wait, they weren't friends. I'm like, no, they had a weird, complicated relationship, but Halleck did have some praise for Grant and did ultimately keep him around. He ultimately did not fire Grant after Shiloh. That's important. Now, Grant's put in a humiliated position, and in some ways he has to be. Grant is being blasted in newspapers. His own soldiers despise him. He's actually being booed when he rides by. So, yeah, you can't not penalize Grant after Shiloh, all right? And I know people are like, oh, but he won the battle. I'm like, yes, he did. And his decision to hold on at that last line and to set that last defensive line are all very commendable decisions. But Shiloh is not Grant at his best. I think Grant at his best is like Fort Donelson. You know, he's excellent at that. So anyway, I'm just trying to say, if Halleck had not penalized Grant, there would have been an uproar.
That makes sense. I mean, unprecedented casualties at that point in the war. People must have been, you know, truly horrified. But what came out of Shiloh, so I could see why Grant would have to bear the responsibility for his part in that.
Yeah, and also being surprised the way he was. I mean, he didn't post any Union cavalry south of the army. What the hell is that?
Kind of basic.
That's really dumb, you know.
Roger that.
But I mean, these guys are, I don't want to emphasize that. These guys are human, you know. I mean, we can go find some really dumb things Robert E. Lee did if you want to, you know.
Exactly. And
especially even early in the war, Sherman wrote about that. He said that Sherman even wrote a bit after the war that Grant and his staff at Shiloh made a lot of amateur mistakes that he said by 1864 they were not making anymore.
There it is. And to have 160 years to look at 48 hours in a man's life That's actually one of the best things about Grant is that his staff work in the Civil War goes from being some of the worst to being some of the best at the end. But anyway, so where was it? Yeah. So this is the beginning of a long descent for Beauregard, I'm assuming, in his military career with the Confederacy.
Sort of, not exactly. This is his low point, though. This is the low point of the entire career, except maybe the very end of the war. Yeah, actually, no, he has two low points. This one and Sherman's march. But anyway, so the thing about Corinth is that, sure, Halleck's not a military genius. I'm really critical of him, but he did exactly what he needed to do at Corinth to make sure he would actually take the town, which is he made a quick march south, and then he fortified his lines and advanced very steadily. And Beauregard's an engineer, and he's not a fool. He knew if he attacked headfirst in the entrenchments, he'd be slaughtered. He actually did try to launch two attacks to get around Pope's flank. Those attacks failed because Earl Van Dorn failed to get his men the proper place, because Earl Van Dorn actually has maybe the worst staff of the Civil War. And, we could criticize Beauregard for relying on Van Dorn. I think what Beauregard thought was that Van Dorn was aggressive and his troops came from west of the Mississippi, and Beauregard just had a high opinion of his men because he thought they were great fighters. And they were hella good fighters for sure. But, I think if Beauregard can make an error there, it's that he tried to rely on Van Dorn for this instead of somebody else. Like Bragg probably would have been better at it. Whatever your criticism of Bragg would be, his men were well disciplined and could actually could pull off marches better than the other ones could. So anyway, so they're not able to save Corinth. However, the evacuation of Corinth, absolutely brilliant. I mean, the Federals don't even know they're gone. They had the whole thing with the trains going in and out, and then men cheering for reinforcements that aren't there. The orders to actually retreat weren't even given to some units until hours before they pulled out. So there was no chance of like some picket or a deserter letting the Federals know what's up. So really one of the most masterful evacuations of the Civil War. And a big contrast to Joseph E. Johnston, because Joseph E. Johnston, I don't know what was with that guy. Anytime he had to retreat from a place, he also had to make sure that they lost all their equipment and everything. Yeah, no, he has his reputation as a great defensive commander and great on retreat. I think he's like one of the worst. But I'm sorry, I'm really negative on Joseph E. Johnston.
No worries at all. Appreciate any and all opinions as we pursue this. So how does Beauregard wind up back on the East Coast going into 1863?
He's fired because he took a medical leave. He actually hadn't left though yet, but he informed Davis that he was going on a medical leave. He hadn't requested to go on the leave. So Davis considered that desertion of his post and removed him promptly. Davis, of course, is not happy with Beauregard at this time. At the same time, I would contend that Davis was himself in poor health. And the fact that Beauregard's health actually was not good during 1862 for sure. He had throat surgery. So I think Davis was like, well, if I'm tough enough to still carry out my presidential duties every day, you should be tough enough to be out there. That's just the feeling I get. He hung out in Mobile for a bit, and Davis, after some discussion, sends him to South Carolina because the governor of South Carolina, Governor Pickens, requests Beauregard.
Is he still highly regarded in South Carolina because of his original defense of Charleston the attack on Sumter in 1861? Does he still have reputation there?
Oh yeah, he kind of used to. There's an unusual monument to him that I saw there. I'm actually not sure if it's still up or not. My guess is probably not. There used to be a really, really good painting of him that used to hang in their city hall, but it's now in their Confederate Museum, so it's been loaned out.
Gotcha.
But anyway,
so he's back in South Carolina.
Yeah, but no, I'm sorry, that's today. I meant back then. Of course, he does still have a high reputation.
Okay.
Pickens was upset with John C. Pemberton. The decision is made to send Beauregard. And the way Davis sees it, it'll keep the South Carolinians happy. And Davis did still consider Beauregard a very good engineer. So he figured the defense of Charleston needs an engineer. Charleston rehabilitates his career. The Federals launch a major offensive to take the city with 10th Corps, which is about roughly 20,000 troops, and their best warships. Like most of the monitors are being sent here. So Charleston is one of the major Union offensives of 1863.
Does that get any, and I'm going on a tangent, and I apologize, because 1863, everyone gets wrapped around the axle about Vicksburg, and they get excited about, Gettysburg and the lead up to it with Chancellorsville. Is there any book you'd recommend specifically about Charleston in 1863? Anything that you could learn more about that campaign besides the fantastic Dreams of Victory, which we'll certainly discuss it, but
Gate of Hell.
Okay, very cool.
Excellent book. And that's one of those books where that's actually one of those books. In some ways, it is Beauregard's best campaign. So you really do, reading that book in particular, you really do see Beauregard at his very best.
Got it. So he fends off 10th Corps basically, is what I'm hearing here in 1863.
Yeah, it's It's one of his two high points as a general, I would say. And it should be kept in mind too, everyone else loses in 1863, right? Like, Vicksburg falls, Bragg is forced out of Tullahoma and Chattanooga. The victory at Chickamauga is a hollow victory and then is followed up with defeat at Chattanooga. Port Hudson falls. You said people getting excited. People should get excited about Port Hudson. That's a campaign, all right? That's a fascinating campaign. That's easily one of my favorites of the Civil War. But yeah, it's just disastrous defeat after defeat. Little Rock was captured. I mean, you can just keep going on and on. And then think about after 1863 in Virginia. It's not good for Lee. I mean, sure, you don't lose a battle of scale at Gettysburg, but Bristow Station, Rappahannock Station are not the kind of battles you want to fight.
Roger.
Yeah, so 1863 is very brutal for the Confederates. And really their only major strategic victory is Charleston. That's it. Everywhere else is defeat. And this once again makes Beauregard, he's no longer as popular as 1861, but he is once again a popular, well-regarded general. So there's a lot of pressure on Davis in 1864 to give him a bigger command, including pressure from Lee and Bragg. That's something to keep in mind too. Lee constantly was trying to get Beauregard to serve under him.
Mm-hmm.
And was always, whenever Davis would say, well, who should command the Army of Tennessee? Lee almost always said Beauregard.
Now, does that tie back to any time in Mexico when I'm assuming they would have served together as engineers on Scott's staff? Did Lee have personal knowledge of Beauregard's qualities?
Yes, they served together on the staff. They did a lot of work together. When you read about Scott's staff doing things, the name like Lee and Beauregard went here, you run into it all the time.
Got it.
I think Lee understood that Beauregard was a popular, very competent commander. So for winning Charleston, Davis comes down to Charleston early 1864 and praises one of Beauregard's subordinates, but not Beauregard. What an insult. But regardless, with all the pressure put on him, Davis puts Beauregard in command of forces south of Richmond and in North Carolina. And with those forces, he will fend off the Federals at Bermuda Hundred, which I also wrote about in Grant's Left Hook. Bermuda Hundred campaign, complicated, interesting campaign. It isn't Beauregard's best campaign by any means. He's kind of sick during it. The Battle of Drury's Bluff is actually not a battle he fights particularly well, but it is still a success in the end. Butler is driven off, and the pressure on Richmond is relieved, and then vital reinforcements can be sent to Lee in time for Cold Harbor.
Understood.
And that leads to what is seen by anybody who, with any knowledge of this, as Beauregard's best victory, which is Petersburg. So for that one, Grant shifted the army away from Richmond, crossed the James River to attack Petersburg. The overall operational conception is excellent, but of course it'd be. Grant is an excellent at operational maneuver. And Lee fails to detect what Grant is doing because there's enough cavalry. And Lee was very terrified that he was actually just going to go make a short march and then try to hit Richmond from the south. And so Lee is absolutely concentrated on Richmond. He sent some troops back to Beauregard, but Lee is slow to react to the situation. Now, June 15th, Beauregard's only in command at the very end of the day, which the Federals had overrun the initial defensive line. He then sets up a backup defensive line, and the Confederates hold out on June 16th and 17th, despite being outnumbered. The Union also fails to attack Beauregard's exposed right flank. So for the Federals, this is debatably their most horribly managed battle of the war. I mean, we're talking disjointed attacks, reconnaissance failures. Grant seems to think a siege is going to happen anyway and gives barely any direction. There's one point on June 17th where Meade, after a successful dawn attack by the 9th Corps, instead of pressing the attack, doing anything, he just sits down to write a letter to his wife. Now, we have to understand that this is the tail end of the Overland campaign. It is extremely hot. These men are exhausted. They have also suffered absolutely horrific casualties that have broken the Army of the Potomac.
Do you think perhaps, and I don't mean to put words in your mouth, the idea of Grant accompanying Meade so you have the operational headquarters and the tactical headquarters so co-located, and there may have been a point where the lines of authority are blurred. So where Meade should have exercised a tighter grip, he might have assumed Grant was going to want to step in, whereas Grant would assume that his senior tactical commander would be doing his job. Was there a, if we placed a Venn diagram over the levels of command, was there a gap there because both commanding officers assumed the other general would be doing something?
I think there's definitely some of that, especially early in the Overland campaign. And this is the whole argument he made that influences things at Cold Harbor. I mean, Grant is going to be there with the Army because, for one thing, he wants to fight Lee. He wants to be like, I'm the guy who beat Lee, right? But also, Grant was told by Lincoln, Stanton, and Halleck to fire Meade. Now, some of them were, like, Lincoln was a little gentler about it, because that's Lincoln, he's very indirect. So he's like, you do what you want to do, but I don't like him. That's essentially what he tells him. Stanton straight up says, there's a weak man in command of the Army, and you be good dude, you do well to remove him. Because, Stanton has all the subtlety of a sledgehammer. Yeah, I think that guy was a sociopath, personally. But anyways, so, this is a great story where Grant meets Meade, and Meade immediately says, I'll do whatever you want. And Grant said, this impressed me more than Gettysburg. And a lot of people hear that and they go, wow, that's great. And I'm like, no, wait a second. What you're telling me is him saying that I'll do whatever you want and be extremely obedient is more impressive than the man who won the largest battle in the Western Hemisphere. And that to me really told that when I read that line, I thought, and I looked at everything else, I'm like, Grant prefers obedience over anything else, which is not necessarily a bad thing, I'm saying, because, Grant has some good generals, but he does also keep around some idiots for sure.
Oh, I got you.
Oh, especially if he's on the White House. That's one thing that's in trouble, But anyway, so he has to go with Meade because he knows that him even keeping Meade is already seen as suspect by his superiors. And one of the things Grant is really good at is the politics of war. So fun little side, like after Vicksburg, Grant and Banks, the guy who took Port Hudson, they want to go take Mobile. And then Lincoln says, no, I want you to go to Texas. And Banks and Grant are like, Texas? That's a backwater. Now, it's doing this for political and diplomatic reasons, especially diplomatic because the French are in Mexico.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, so that's what he's like, yeah, let's go do this, right? Grant actually writes a letter to Lincoln saying, this is not a good idea. We want to go to Mobile. And then Lincoln sends a rather cold letter to Grant and says, you're going to Texas. And then Grant's next letter is, it's a brilliant idea, sir. Absolutely brilliant. So he knows that but Grant's also smart enough to know that keeping Meade around makes the officers in the Army of the Potomac happy. Because, and I know we're getting to a side of the Army of the Potomac, but what happens with the Army of the Potomac was that it's driven by politics. And that really goes back to the fact that McClellan didn't choose his corps commanders. They were chosen for him. And the corps commanders they chose were guys who didn't like McClellan.
Gotcha.
That's a great vote of confidence, by the way. If I'm going to send a commander off on the campaign that's supposed to win the war, I want to pick his subordinates for him and make sure they're guys who don't like him. So the Army of the Potomac has political factions. It's very poisonous. But enough of them liked Meade. And it also helped that Meade had no interest in politics at all. This is very big because one of the things that really hurts McClellan is that he's a Democrat who wants to become president. So he's being actively undermined by his own government. A lot of them want him to lose in Richmond. They all know that Meade, even though he's a dirty Democrat, at least he doesn't want to be president.
Gotcha. So
that and the support he has of a lot of political officers, a lot of the officers such as, Hancock, Sedgwick, Gibbon, the list goes on and on. Almost all your high-ranking Army of the Potomac commanders want Meade in command. So I think Grant also saw like, hey, he's liked by his own men. Keep him around. But once again, Grant, smart move, very smart move on Grant's part. But anyway, so.
But Meade was not at his best in June of 1864 against Petersburg.
No, but like I said, they're exhausted. The morale is horrible in the Army. They've suffered horrific casualties. The letters at the time are men whose spirits are broken. One guy actually writes a letter. He says, why do we have to lose 50,000 men to get to the same point McClellan reached by losing only 4,000? I'm like, great question. And that's a whole other can of worms because, you know, Grant wasn't a butcher. He didn't want to just brawl with Lee. He did it because he knew Lincoln wanted him to do it. Grant's original plan was to go to North Carolina and cut the railroads. Great plan.
Concur.
Yeah. Or he also wanted to go up the peninsula approaches the way McClellan did, because that's a great plan. But nope, Lincoln and Halleck and Stanton want him to go brawl it out with Lee. And if Grant has one big weakness, he's not the best tactician. So it resulted in horrific casualties.
Yes, sir.
I know Lee suffered heavy casualties too, which had a big effect on his army. But one thing I can tell you, there's a difference in the letters. The letters in Lee's army, they are feeling a lot more confident. I mean, they're all acknowledging this has been the hardest campaign yet of the war, but we're beating them in every battle. We're inflicting heavier losses. They're seeing the newspapers and also the price of gold shooting up. At any rate, though, like you're talking about a culminating point, that's Petersburg.
Gotcha.
And the painful thing about that for Grant is that it's the first time he outmaneuvered Lee. But the army's too weak to pull it off.
Gotcha.
And then hurting it as well is the fact that Beauregard's in command. He's a brilliant engineer. He's excellent at using terrain. He's good at rallying his men and keeping them in the lines. And, you know, let's face it, this guy wins more battles than he loses during the Civil War. So I don't know, maybe if like Bragg or, okay, if Joseph E. Johnston had been there, Petersburg falls immediately. War over, ends right then and there. But it doesn't help that you have the Confederacy's second best independent army commander right there.
Gotcha.
Yes, second best. I'm not going with Stonewall Jackson. He never commanded more than 20,000 men. All right. I mean, he's good, right? But, you know, he's not an army commander. All right.
Understood. So anyway. after Petersburg, that obviously you said that's, you know, I don't, again, not wanting to put words in your mouth, but definitely a high point for Beauregard. And at this point, what's his next step?
He is now second in command to Robert E. Lee. And it's a frustrating time for him. He is actually given an order to attack the Union lines a few days after the battle. And Beauregard drew up an overly complicated attack plan that failed. So one of his worst points. Now, this is not really like a big battle. This casualties are only a few hundred. So it's not really thought of as like the Battle of Hare House Hill. But that's kind of what I guess it should be thought of as. But anyway, a botched attack. And Davis repays Beauregard winning the Battle of Petersburg by trying to open an investigation over him evacuating his troops from Bermuda Hundred during the battle. And very quickly people go, especially people like Lee, are like, really? You're going to do this right now? So it's thought of, and then Davis backs down. Yeah, and we didn't even get to Drury's Bluff, where Davis and the Battle of Drury's Bluff, Davis arrived to see Beauregard's plan not work. And this came after him and the two of them had a bit of a thaw in their relationship. So that really sealed it off for him. But anyway, that was during the Bermuda Hundred campaign. So anyways, Beauregard was actually at the crater when it first went off.
Oh, wow.
But Lee arrived soon after, but Beauregard was at his side throughout the battle. And then Globe Tavern is the next one. This is where the Federals try to cut the Weldon Railroad. This battle lasts several days. The first two Confederate attacks are successful and inflict heavy losses on the Union, but there's not enough Confederates to exploit the success. That's the thing you also find a lot in the Petersburg campaign. You have like Jerusalem Plank Road, Reams Station. People will say like, well, Lee's army wasn't capable of offensive action. I'm like, I don't know. It seemed like they could do it pretty well when they have the flank, you know. But anyway, so Globe Tavern, though, they ultimately cannot push them off the last line. There's kind of a bitter irony to it because the Union commander there actually dug some entrenchments. So it was kind of like reverse Petersburg, where you're like, because, you know, Beauregard, one of the boldest things he did, I should have mentioned this at Petersburg, was that even while the Federals were attacking him, he had some of his men back digging a third line of defense. And then he retreated that line on the night of June 17th to 18th. And from what we can tell, there were almost no issues with the retreat during the night. Because one of the things they did was they put stakes in the ground. So in the night, the men just were grabbing the stakes and moving in a line. So brilliantly done, like retreating right in the face of the enemy in the middle of the night to your last defensive line. The Union kind of did something like that at Globe Tavern, although not quite as dramatic. And so there's a bit of irony for that one. But by that time, Beauregard's his spirits are shot. He's very depressed. Davis is livid about Globe Tavern. And then Lee says, I think Beauregard should be sent somewhere else. The situation's awkward for him. Lee defended his actions at Globe Tavern. And of course he would, because a lot of the reasons why the attack failed was because of some of Lee's interventions in the battle. And by the way, think about Globe Tavern too. It is a Union victory, but their losses were almost 3-1 to the Confederates. So definitely a Pyrrhic victory. And also and them taking the railroad didn't hurt the Confederate supply situation that badly. Because by that time, the Weldon Railroad was not being used as much as it was previously. But anyway, so Beauregard was eventually made. By this time, Atlanta had fallen. And that's an interesting contrast, Like, why does Atlanta fall and not Petersburg? Like, why does Atlanta take, what is it? Like, not even 2 months to fall. And Petersburg takes, 9 months, 10 months? That's a pregnancy. All right. Well, it's because Sherman didn't have his army make moronic attacks into the face of entrenchments. I know Kennesaw Mountain excluded, but he didn't try that again afterwards, did he?
No, sir.
No. Get around their flank. You'll eventually get there. So when he gets to Atlanta, he has an army that is confident, that has not suffered horrendous losses, and they're able to pull off swift marches that eventually allow them to take Atlanta. So everybody's calling for Hood to be removed. Lee mentions Beauregard as a possibility. Richard Taylor really pressed for that to happen. Taylor was friends with both Davis and Beauregard and thought maybe he could get them to get along. It doesn't happen. Hood will remain in command, but has decided to make Beauregard commander of the entire Western Theater, which means he was supposed to oversee the Confederate forces in Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, Florida, South Carolina, and in Georgia, whenever they have in Tennessee. He will prove Hood's attack into Tennessee, but he gets very critical of Hood because the attack doesn't happen fast enough. He was also upset with Hood's treatment of black soldiers who had been captured. And so they didn't have the best relationship at that point. And here comes Beauregard's second low point. Sherman's marching from Atlanta to Savannah, and Beauregard's the one who has to oversee the defense. A completely hopeless situation.
I'm assuming he doesn't have that much combat power with which to resist it to begin with.
No. Now, to his credit, what forces they have are able to get away and get into South Carolina. He's in command in South Carolina when that gets invaded by Sherman. And he really does bungle the defense of South Carolina. But I'm just like, even if he doesn't bungle the defense, they're getting slaughtered, But at that point, he is put under Joseph E. Johnston. This guy can't help but be under a guy named Johnston, can he? It happens all the damn time. So he kind of serves as Johnston's second in command. But really all he does is oversee forwarding supplies and troops and moving stuff around the rear. After Bentonville, he actually asked Johnston, can I come with the army? And maybe I can help rally the men. And Johnston goes, no. His last act is he is at the conference where Johnston tells Davis the war is lost and it's over and give it up. And Davis looked at Beauregard after Johnston said that and asked Beauregard, what do you think? And all he said was, I concur. And there, for the most part, ends his Civil War career outside of overseeing the surrender, or helping to oversee the surrender in North Carolina.
Did he go directly back to New Orleans after the war? Did he travel a bit? What was his...
Directly back to New Orleans. A long trek from North Carolina to Mobile, where they get a boat, and then he lands in New Orleans. And he didn't announce that he was coming. People found out, and he was greeted all along the road, people throwing flowers in the street. And then he went to the home where his second wife was living, but she had died the previous year.
Oh, what a shame.
Yeah. So then, go ahead.
So as reading the book, it seems like he was the, and you alluded to this a little bit in the beginning, he was a, I don't want to say a unique figure, but kind of like the opposite of what one would think. You know, he is not someone who is up, you know, about, you know, subjugating now freed men. He seems like he's a little bit more open to reconciliation. How do you see his post-war career playing out?
Let me get a quick drink of water here.
Sure thing.
On the one hand, he's a big success in terms of engineering. He'll oversee two railroads that were in trouble, make sure both of them are successful. He was ousted from both railroads, though, so in that regard, it wasn't a success. But still, you know, it's a good part of his career. He was oftentimes frustrated. You mentioned the thing about reconciliation. Beauregard, in many ways, is not for reconciliation with the sections. Like especially right after the war, his letters about the North are pretty damn bitter. However, he was related to free people of color, and he had friends who were free people of color. So he very early on is saying that no, former slaves deserve equal voting and civil rights. He wrote that in several newspapers, and then of course gets involved in the unification movement. That fails. So after that, Beauregard simply supported racial moderates like Randall Gibson and Francis Nichols. Although Nichols will later on be the one who brings in segregation, but the reason for that is because he was being extremely petty, because the free people of color, well, not at this point, they're sorry, the freedmen, some black politicians in Louisiana voted to keep the Louisiana lottery around, which Nichols absolutely hated. So out of revenge, he said, just for that, I'm going to pass a segregated rail car bill. Just being a petty jerk, you know?
Gotcha.
Anyway, but yeah, so Beauregard, politically in that regard, is a failure. He wasn't very good at the political game outside of when he supported Franklin Pierce in 1852, and then when he supports Gibson and Nichols in 1876. But, you know, I'd say in that regard, he's a civil rights advocate, but I'd never call him an activist. For one thing, anytime he got involved in politics, it was always brief and his letters are always just, you can see the frustration. He gets involved in politics because he's interested in it, but he's bad at it. Probably his biggest mistake is doing the Louisiana lottery, because it's a corrupt institution. He's not corrupt in the institution, but that means he either knows it and doesn't care, or he's stupid and doesn't realize it. This really hurts his reputation, though.
Understood.
Being involved in the corrupt lottery, he gets paid, and when he dies, he'll leave his family this isn't a robber baron fortune, but they're well off afterwards. Also, he got involved in a lot of bitter disputes after the Civil War. And, you know, you get this with the Union as well, but I think there's one of the differences is that, you know, Grant and Sherman do write their memoirs. They're very readable memoirs. Of course, I mean, Sherman's he's a fantastic writer. You know, Grant's memoirs are pretty well written. But I mean, they're memoirs, especially Grant's memoirs. I mean, they are written by a guy who's dying.
Yes, sir.
And who, love him or hate him, he is petty. He's a very petty man. I mean, look, you know what happened with James Garfield, right?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, Garfield. Yeah. Garfield wins the nomination. So Grant, right afterwards, instead of endorsing him immediately, goes on vacation. He goes camping, and does not endorse him until later on. And even then, is fairly lukewarm in his support. Anyways, it's a petty guy. But I think one of the things that helped out Sherman and Grant was that Buell and Rosecrans and some of their critics, I mean, look, Thomas died. And Thomas is a weird one because Thomas was friends with Sherman, although they had a complicated relationship. But anyway, you know, what I mean is that a lot of the people who would have been more critical of Grant, like Rosecrans didn't write his memoirs. The Confederates are different. They all of them write their memoirs and tell you about how much the other guy sucks. No, the memoirs are so big. Longstreet's memoirs, Hood, Beauregard, Davis, Johnston. These are pretty bitter documents in a lot of ways. And I guess they would be because the added stuff with defeat and then all the political fights afterwards. In the case of Beauregard, think about him in terms of Longstreet. Longstreet's really hated after the war because of many things. He had the temerity to say Lee wasn't infallible. He supported the Republican Party.
Yes, sir.
Now, Beauregard, by supporting equal voting and civil rights, made sure that those Confederates who were going to be the ones who were, those Confederates who really, really hated that the freedmen could vote, didn't like Beauregard. But Beauregard, though, never made the mistake of voting Republican.
Yes, sir.
In their eyes. In fact, that was one of the things he wanted to do. He would say, we need to embrace the freedmen because with their votes, we can destroy the Republicans. I mean, he hates the Republican Party. So anyway, there's so many layers to the way the arguments work. And in the case of Beauregard, he attacked Lee, but he did it more subtly than, I mean, it wasn't subtle necessarily, but it was more subtle than the attacks that Longstreet launched. He simply pointed out that Lee did not react fast enough at Petersburg, that maybe Lee wasn't like the god of war. He was very critical of the Lee cult. Mm-hmm. Although he would still praise Lee, and he did openly say, he said, yeah, Lee was one of the finest officers I knew, one of the best commanders. He just said, I don't think he's Napoleon incarnate, though. At the same time, Beauregard's actual memoirs, they're not a superb read. They're actually what I found, though, some of the most accurate memoirs I've run into.
Oh, interesting.
Not everything, but I'd put him in the top 4 or 5.
Very cool.
For trustworthiness. I think it's also because there's a lot of official record documents in there. And he really did, to research his own memoirs, he was very meticulous overall. So there's some problems here and there and some issues, but overall pretty damn accurate, I'd say. It's one of the better ones.
Outstanding.
But yeah, no, him and Davis, he got into feuds with Johnston. He criticized Lee. And of course, he was in a bitter feud with Davis. So when Davis died in New Orleans, he was buried here for a few years, and there was this grand funeral for him, the biggest in New Orleans history. But Beauregard is not there, even though he was asked to be the head of the procession. He said something like, I hated him and he hated me. I will not attend. I am no hypocrite.
Oh, there you go. True to himself to the end.
Yeah.
Sean, I think that's a good note to go out on. You've been very generous with your time, and I've kept you far longer than we had agreed to. So before we wrap up, though, I really would like to ask, I know you're going on tour because the book's just out and you're promoting it, but do you have any idea what's next?
I'm working a few other books, Emerging Civil War. Being a tour guide gives me a lot of time to work on stuff. So what I'll do is I'll work on one for, a few weeks or a few months, and then I'll be like, I'm tired of Port Hudson. Let's go do something else. And then, get shift between them. My main thing right now is doing Shiloh. I'm doing the maps of Shiloh. Do you know this book series?
I sure do. I'm looking over my bookshelf right now. I can see a couple of the ones I got.
Yeah, what you got?
I've got Gettysburg and I've got Chickamauga.
Okay, I've got Chickamauga. That's a great one. Dave Powell's good. That'd be a good guy to have on if you can. Anyway, so cool. So I'm working with Brad. He's making the maps, and we're just going to have the most detailed telling of Shiloh that we can do. And I've done enough research to where I'm going to do a 2-volume book on the whole Shiloh campaign, from evacuation of Nashville all the way to the fall of Corinth. With, of course, right now the bibliography is 96 pages long.
Oh wow!
Yeah, but I mean, the thing about it is that it would have to be. One of the nice things about Shiloh is the 3 previous books on it. The 3 previous big ones are written by Wiley Sword, Larry J. Daniel, and Timothy B. Smith, and all 3 of them are excellent books. But if I'm going to disagree with any of those men, I better, which are like 3 of the biggest names, especially in Western Civil War history. If I'm going to disagree with any of them, I better have some footnotes to back this up.
Understood. Squared away. So how is this like a long horizon project? You're thinking like you have Shiloh done by 2026 kind of thing, or are you just gonna chip away at it and someday it'll be done?
Maps of Shiloh we've been working at steadily for years. Slow process, but COVID in many ways helped out a lot. A lot of free time to do research.
Gotcha.
And a lot of research places would send stuff. So I got a lot of things away. Anyway, so what I'm doing is the Maps of Shiloh is Timothy B. Smith's reading it over right now, and then Stacey Allen at the park will read over it. So we're doing all of those things, and I hope to have it submitted next year. And then we'll see when it comes out, because who knows, right?
Yes, sir.
And the 2-volume Shiloh book, I hope to have the first draft done by the end of the year. It's a steady process, but if I just do a few a week, although I'm taking a bit of a writing break right now because I burned myself out a bit earlier this year. So I'm only doing light stuff in June.
Very cool.
So that's kind of the plan with that one.
Well, wonderful. I hopefully once both Maps of Shiloh and your 2 volumes are out, we would love to have you back on the show to talk a little bit more. I feel like we had a decent Shiloh discussion tonight, but we would love to deep dive it with you when you are ready.
Yeah, we did. That was the one we did the most detail on. That is right. Anyways.
But so everybody, this has been Power for the Commander's Voice. My guest tonight has been Sean Michael Chick. The book is Dreams of Victory. It's an excellent overview of the career of PGAT Beauregard. You heard it here from Sean tonight. He's definitely a subject matter expert, and I highly urge you all to get the book. You can get it from Savas Beatie Publishing. Sean, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
You're welcome.
All right, take care. You have a good one.